shall we move on to Michael chairing the art and culture session? Or...
Wow, thank you for that, Miranda. You know, that conversation could have gone on and on and on, but let's move on to something even more exciting, art.
Well, actually quite well segued into art there, didn't I?
No, you did. Steady. That was good. I'm excited about this session because three aspects of art from three very different people. We're gonna have a multimedia artist, we're gonna have an historian, and then we're gonna have a curator activist. You know, so there's really a real mixture. We're actually gonna kick off with Melissa Hill. She's a British actor, a British American multimedia artist who deals with the current events and human rights. She's interested in how power structures operate to protect themselves and justify inflicting human suffering. And she's done a great work, but I'll let her talk about it. So Melissa, the floor is yours.
Thank you. I'm going to just share my screen here. Can everybody see that? Hello?
Yeah, we can see it. I can see it.
Okay. Right. So I'm going to talk a little bit about me. Like most humans, I started small and then I got big. And as my mother often liked to say, I seem to go around upsetting people a lot. And that's because I objected to things. So this is one of the first major protests that I participated in quite a small way. I went to Sarah Lawrence College in New York. I was studying economics. And there was quite a big demonstration in 1991 where we wanted the administration to offer more tenured positions to faculty of color. And so that was the start of my glorious, obnoxious career, I suppose, where I'm still objecting to things. So this will look more familiar to you all. This particular
Oh no, it seems we lost Melissa.
Yeah, Melissa, we've lost your sound. We can still see your screen, but we can't hear you.
Melissa,
Send her a message in the chat. Melissa, can you hear us at all?
I bet she's running around like crazy now, pressing all the buttons and trying to make it happen. It's so frustrating. But look, what I think we'll do is, Mark, if you're ready, if you're good to go.
I think that's a good idea.
Yeah, if you're good to go, Mark, we'll cut to you, and then when Melissa comes back, we'll switch to her. So, Mark, tell me you're there.
I'm here. Can you hear me?
I can hear and I can see. So do you want? Well, first, if a brief introduction, a very brief introduction. Mark's he comes as a mature postgraduate student at the Institute of Historical Studies. His dissertation was on Camden Town, and from this he found John Wilmot, a subject of today's talk, and taking a contemporary themes about aspects of Black history and women as local history, and looking forward to sharing this session with us. And just on a personal note, I'm really looking forward to this, Mark, because you found how Black people are hidden in plain sight in so much of the art on the walls in our galleries. So look, as I said, I'm very much looking forward to it. So as I said to Melissa, the floor is yours. Please stay with us.
Just the words I like to use. Can Melissa...
No, if you just share your screen, you'll take over.
Okay. Lovely. And it's welcome to be at this conference. And I'm going to read off my notes on the left-hand side of me. These are talks on cultural and artistic representations of Black history with an international flavor. And I'm going to consider two linked images, first an engraving and then a joint oil painting that were created at the beginning of the 19th century, about the later 18th century.
Mark, sorry to interrupt you. Do you want me to share the screen for you?
Not yet.
No, okay.
It's coming in 2 minutes.
Sorry.
I'm just introducing it. I'm going to talk about two elite men, Benjamin West and John Wilmot, who is a philanthropist and writer. And I'm going to show about how these relate to contemporary themes of diversity and loyalty and wider subjects of migration, identity, and decolonization. And now I want to put on my share screen and hope that that works, if I can find it. Okay. The first image is an engraving by Henry Moses. This was in 1815. He worked with Benjamin West. There are three groupings you can see on the left: younger people, some of whom are Black. On the right, men in gowns and wigs, surrounded by others. At the back, in the hats of Quakers, and in the center, with arms outstretched. I'll move this. A Native American is accompanying a woman, eyes downcast, who is a widow leading the children behind her. Oops. But I've only shown you a part of the picture. Here in full, we can see a man and a woman standing on the far right with a crown on the table, and above a towering and encompassing Britannia. This Britannia, welcoming the loyalists, is an allegory, an artistic device to represent abstract ideas about the real world issues. Here it's classical in style, but the clothes are contemporary for the period. The engraving is the opened out frontispiece of a book by John Eardley Wilmot, you can see, which was published in 1815. The title below the picture is Reception of the American Loyalists by Great Britain in the year 1783. That's 30 years before Wilmot's book wrote his book, or published the book. The longer title on the right-hand side of the front page says the book is about a commission for American loyalists, and rather a lot of other words in the title. Historian Simon Sharman, amongst several other authors, including Cassandra Pybus and Maya Yasinoff, has written tellingly about the diaspora of people after the American War. But Sharma called the picture of the reception by Britannia an outrageously self-serving fiction. Blacks, he observed, were at the end of the queue, literally so in the picture, and were barely received by Britain. Who were American loyalists? From 1776, the colonists on the east coast of North America, who'd arrived over the previous 150 years, mainly from Britain, engaged in a war against British rule and in due course brought in France as their ally. The struggle was concluded in 1783 in the Treaty of Paris, bringing British peace with France and independence for the 13 United States. The majority of people accepted their new identity as Americans, but some, including some enslaved people who'd been given freedom if they joined the British Army, left for other British colonies in Canada, the Caribbean, and some, as we've heard earlier in these sessions, to Sierra Leone in Africa. And some, at this point and earlier, returned or came to England. Should there be payment from America to these people who'd lost their land? Benjamin Franklin, born in Boston, Massachusetts, the son of English emigres who led the Paris negotiations for the Americans, took a hard line. He argued that if loyalists were to be indemnified, it would be necessary also to reckon up the damage they had done in burning villages and shipping, and then to strike a balance. But many of the loyalists that has come to England earlier in the war were dependent on temporary financial support from the Treasury. In 1783, after the peace treaty, the British Parliament created a commission to agree single payments for those who had lost property whilst remaining loyal to the British Crown. The government entrusted this task to a young member of Parliament, John Wilmot, who had been against the war from the start. The commission took 6 years to complete its records. Full of detailed accounts of people's lives in America at that time, they are stored and readable now in the National Archives in London. About 3,000 loyalists' compensation claims were accepted, and of these, about 50 were identified more recently as being by Black people. They often had difficulty in proving either their ownership or loss of property. Half of these Black applicants received some financial support, but mainly small sums of money. After he completed the commission, Wilmot started a new endeavour to raise funds to support more impoverished migrants, now the émigrés arriving from France to escape their revolution and the terror. Later, when Wilmot retired from being a practicing lawyer, he wrote a book about his father and then about his work for the commission. The engraving we've seen was the frontispiece for this final book that we've seen, published in the year of his death in 1815. Wilmot got little public recognition for his service, either for the commission or for the émigrés, but in 1810, funds were found for a portrait of him, and the person chosen and who agreed to paint the portrait was no less than the president of the Royal Academy of Arts in London, Benjamin West. West had grown up in Pennsylvania in America. He journeyed to Europe to see Italian painting and had stayed in London, where he became highly successful, including with King George III. In 1790, he was elected as the second president of the Royal Academy of Arts, following Sir Joshua Reynolds. Compared with Reynolds, who was a portraitist primarily, engaged directly with the society that he lived within, West's work was from a different genre as a history painter, depicting stories or events from the past imagined in dramatic form on the canvas. In these times, most history painting drew on classical themes. West's innovation was recreating current events in contemporary costumes. In several of his earlier pictures, West included Native Americans, whom he had known in his childhood in Pennsylvania. This picture of William Penn's treaty shows elders from both white and Native American communities. His earlier picture of the death of Wolfe, which had much impressed King George III, and a Native American warrior in the foreground. But after the Declaration of Independence by the 13 United States, was West settled in London, English, or was he American? He'd been elected president of the Royal Academy of Arts. Here is an oil painted by Constable. We see Somerset House, where the Royal Academy was first sited. And on the right, an etching of the Grand Exhibition Hall, with pictures going up to the ceiling. In the early 1800s, there were political rivalries within this Royal Academy. West, along with others from London, had travelled to Paris in 1803 during the amnesty from the war with France. But the war restarted, and with the payment of $15 million by America to France for the Louisiana Purchase on that west side of the middle and west side of the continent, West's Paris journey and his American background were used against him. He was deposed as president of the Royal Academy, and then after a year, he was reinstated as no other candidate was considered suitable or supported. West's patron, King George III, was becoming blind and having increased bouts of madness. In 1810, the power of the throne passed to George's son, Prince Regent, who had little interest in West's work. This was just at the time when West was asked to paint the portrait of John Wilmot. Here is the portrait. Wilmot, in later middle age, is holding the papers about his commission, which is sent to West to read. And behind, painted as if hanging on the wall, is what we see in the reception of Loyalists by Britannia, now in oil colour. I mentioned that Wilmot had written a book about his father, who had been a senior judge. One of the cases that Wilmot, his son, wrote about was of a black woman, Mary Hylas, who'd come to Britain from the Caribbean with her mistress and married in Britain a freed man. When the woman was abducted back to Jamaica and returned to slavery, Wilmot Sr. adjudged it an offence that she was a free woman in the colonial land as well as in England because she was married to a free man. Wilmot would have known this case because he'd written up the judgments of his father in his book. Another aspect of the portrait was Wilmot's support for the French émigrés. By 1810, public opinion was strongly against the post-revolutionary tyranny in France. Thousands had volunteered to defend against Napoleon's planned invasion, and military figures of Nelson and Wellington were popular heroes. Wilmot had backed the right horse, the émigrés, and he was better known for this than for his earlier work with the American Loyalists. There's a denouement for the portrait. In 1970, at the death of Wilmot's great-great-grandson, it was sold by auction in London to the American collector Paul Mellon, and now hangs in the beautiful Yale Center for British Art in New Haven, Connecticut. I went to see it earlier this year, just before COVID, and I was pleased to find on the wall opposite a painting of Benjamin West looking down towards his own challenging handiwork on the opposite wall. And whilst I was there, I was able to look more closely at the hanging picture, the allegory within the portrait. It's painted at the level of a sketch rather than the full painting from the rest of the portrait. But you can see now there are 5 black people of different ages and genders. West had painted them positively, and the girl at the front is looking appreciatively at the young man sitting on the far left. Other themes come out as well. The Native American has a heroic position in comparison with the people we saw sitting and kneeling in the earlier painting of Penn's Treaty. The 2 men in hats at the top are Quakers, a group with pacifist principles and whom West would know had in Britain just a few years before helped achieve the law for abolition of the slave trade. And on the right, the couple standing are West himself with his wife. You can see his artist's palette on the far right beside him and the king's crown in front of him. He is welcoming all these different groups before him. The American War was an early decolonization, a revolution against the colonial power. There was appropriation of property by the winners, who styled themselves patriots and who gained law and power in the new 13 United States, while the losers from varied social groups departed. There was migration and confusion of identity, but even for Benjamin West. His father had been born in England, and Benjamin had arrived before the decolonization. He had achieved a high position, yet his foreign background was held against him. By using the picture as a distant object, West was able to, as you were saying, hide in full view his values of diversity and internationalism, even before, in front of, the conservative Prince Regent who came to view the exhibition. Mainly American scholars have written about these images, and more about the allegory of Britannia than the portrait of loyalty itself. But I'd like to suggest a last contemporary theme, the repatriation of cultural heritage. Rather mischievously, In their catalogue for the sale in 1970, the auctioneers Sotheby's in London wrote that within the portrait hangs the allegorical composition by the artist of peace between America and Great Britain. It is, we've seen, nothing of the sort. But I discovered in the records kindly provided to me at Yale, the advertising bait did encourage the US Department of State to consider a bid. They were hoping to hang the painting as a celebration in one of their public reception rooms. Luckily for them, they were outbid by Mr. Mellon's £36,000. But would a painting about British refugees from colonial revolution and the MP who served Britain in their resettlement now be allowed an export license? And could there be more interest by British scholars and people in the painting's representation of contemporary issues if it could be shown in a public gallery in Britain again, perhaps in the Royal College of Arts? Thank you.
Michael, you're on mute. We can't hear you.
Oh my God. Thank you for that, Joanna. Thank you. Mark, thank that. Well, first, thank you, Joanna. Mark, that was great. A lot of questions there that come to mind in terms of the connections, in terms with America and Britain. And Miranda's made some connection with the actual people, Hylas and others in the painting or connected with the painting. So what I'd like to do is I'd like to move on to Alice. So to give us time for Melissa to come back, hopefully she will come back. And Alice Proctor is going to talk about her discomfort at the truth and representation of British of art in the British galleries. First, a few words about Alice. She's is an art historian, writer, and educator. What she doesn't say there, she's an activist. And she's very much like a sense that Melissa is. She doesn't, an activist. And she's a provocateur. I've got a book here, which I was hoping she would sign when we go in person. But it's not about a book, it's more a polemic. It's more a polemic. So look, I'm looking forward to hearing your paper. Alice, the floor is yours.
Hi, everyone. Thank you so much. I'm really happy to be here, and it's lovely to see you all. It's been a great day, and I hope this is at least a little interesting. I know we're getting towards the end of the afternoon, and things start to get a little sleepy around this time. Firstly, apologies to anyone who's taking part in the Understanding British Portraits conference that's also happening this week, because there's a pretty big overlap between what I'm talking about here and my paper for that event, unfortunately, because the themes that I'm most interested in right now are questions of how we identify portrait subjects, whether that's in academic research or in terms of the kind of labeling that we see in these museums. So, once I've got my slides up, I will be able to start. There we go. As a beginning point for my presentation, I wanted to remind anyone of the Google Doodle that was for the 1st of October this year. This was to mark the beginning of Black History Month, and it's an image that is based on a possible portrait of Ignatius Sancho. Sancho as a figure is a hugely important presence in the British abolitionist movement and in the kind of history of race within the UK. But the immediate reaction to this image was a little mixed. A lot of the tweets I saw about this portrait expressed uncertainty as to whether this was Ignatius Sancho or one of his contemporaries, Olidar Equiano. Equiano does not have a surviving painted portrait that we know of, but we do have engravings of him that are very, very similar to the painting on which the Google Doodle was based. This is the painting. It's in the Royal Albert Memorial Museum in Exeter. And it's had several attributions over the years. It's been described as being both a portrait of Sancho and of Equiano. What's interesting to me here is the fact that we have these two hugely significant and influential figures sharing a single image and the implications that that has for how we understand them historically. We're looking at two people who have been kind of combined and collapsed historically. it's no, it will probably not come as a surprise to a lot of you that this portrait that may be of Sancho Orequiano was the one that we chose to use as the cover of my book, which came out earlier this year. The book grew out of my work as a tour guide running uncomfortable art tours, which is the name I give to my education work. I run alternative tours, shall we say, in national galleries and museums. And I've been very clear throughout the time I've been working on these tours that they don't exist in the same space as Black history tours that specifically focus on the representation of people of color within British art, but that they're more about the history of empire and colonialism. And within that, we need to discuss the kind of creation and construction of racialization. So my position as a white woman, as an art historian, and as an immigrant from Australia is such that I'm very much shaped by the forces of empire and the experience of colonialism, mostly from the perspective of its perpetrators. My work as an educator is therefore to try and make this history more visible and to bring audiences into museums in a way that is welcoming and inclusive by using subjects of empire to understand contemporary history as well. So the images that I want to talk about today are mostly examples of portraits that are in British art collections. Obviously, we can't go and see any of them right now, but my hope is that this can be a bit of a conversation about how we identify and name these subjects. These are two portraits that are most likely of Francis Barber, who was an enslaved person who was later freed and became the servant and kind of close friend and heir of Samuel Johnson. The identity of these portraits has been up for debate over their history. At one point, one of the original paintings that these two sketches are based on, these are student versions of the actual finished painting, was sold as potentially being of a man called Mai, who was a Raitayan Tahitian man who arrived in the UK with the second fleet of Captain Cook that had traveled around the Pacific, and was actually also painted by Reynolds, who most likely completed the actual original version of this painting. So we have this collapsing of multiple identities. We have the collapsing of multiple experiences in the fact that Mai, as a Raitayan man, occupied a very, very different position within British culture to someone like Francis Barber as a Black man. And we see these two subjects being kind of squashed together in a way that damages both of their individual biographies. This painting of Barber is almost always described as a portrait of a Black man or a young Black man. It's often, if we see his name used in the title or in the image description, there'll be a question mark there as well. And this is interesting to me because of the way that we then experience Barber's narrative. He's someone whose identity is left uncertain. He's someone who is almost always described in the context of Samuel Johnson, rather than in the context of his own personal biography. So it's an example to me of the ways that galleries can commit acts of imperialism and relate to histories of imperialism by choosing how they name these subjects. On a similar theme, this is a likely painting of Ira Aldridge, and we have so many portraits of Aldridge in existence. He's a fascinating figure who I'm sure many of you know about, but the thing that interests me most about Aldridge, and the thing that I tend to talk about when I include him in my tours, is the fluidity of his identity. Aldridge looks different in every portrait. His skin tone will be different, his features will be different, and this leads to a lot of uncertainty around the subjecthood of his images. In this case, we know it's a portrait of Aldridge, we have the records and the information, but in other cases, including the painting of him that's in the Tate galleries, there is some uncertainty because of this flexibility around his identity. What I mean by that flexibility is that his skin tone is often shifted depending on the role that he's playing. He uses stage makeup to lighten or darken his complexion. And this is something that the artists who use him as a model also carry through. They're relying on Aldridge as an individual, but they are also using the kind of visual vernacular of their time. And they racialize him and cast him in different ways depending on the narrative that they're trying to present. When he's present in John Simpson's painting of the captive slave, his skin is much, much darker than it is in this painting. And we see this kind of question of fluidity and representation surrounding Aldridge in a very tangible way because we have just so many images of him. The label text here is from a youth project that took place at Manchester Museum. And it's interesting to me because of the distance it has between the actual official gallery and the text that could be written by these young people. This is a much more explicitly critical, almost, I guess, polemical type of writing that really points out the way that his image has been used by the art gallery over time. It's something that interests me because of the way that we see these portraits now surfacing and being put back on show in some cases, particularly around this question of representation and inclusion within galleries. The portraits of Francis Barber were not on display at Tate for quite some time, and they were only recently added back into the galleries in the last year or so. This is interesting to me because they are incomplete pictures. They're pictures that we think are most likely sketches after the original Reynolds. And so their display value is perhaps lower than some of the other paintings that Tate has. And when I'm talking about display value, I mean it in the very cynical art historian way of known subject, finished painting, known artist. They sit lower in that hierarchy than some of the other works in the collection. So the choice to put them back on display for me is interesting. There must be some other source of value, power, or relevance that the gallery have chosen to focus on. Tate have been through it recently, shall we say, particularly when it comes to their representation of colonial history. There was an incident a couple of years ago involving a gallery label on a painting of by Johann Zoffany of East India Company forces that came up for some very well-deserved lambasting on Twitter that referred to the idea that in India, normal rules of morality did not apply, and prompted a bigger discussion about who was writing those labels, how this text was being kind of created, and how these stories were being communicated by the institution. Tate have been working incredibly hard for the past few years to remind everybody that Henry Tate was not actually connected to enslavement, although we have to understand that his role as a sugar merchant means that he is entangled with that history, even if he did not necessarily individually enslave people. We do also know that there were indentured laborers working on the plantations that he owned, and many of these plantations and refineries had been built with enslaved labor in the first place. So Tate's connection to the history of the transatlantic slave trade is perhaps more remote, more proximate than text like this would suggest. But there's more to it for me than just referencing the connections that individuals might have with enslavement. Next to the painting of Ira Aldridge that's on display in the Tate is this image. And it's a little tricky to see because the image itself is so crowded. But at the very front of the image, there's a young boy in blackface, whereas towards the back, there is a coachman who's represented with extremely dark skin and quite heavily caricatured features compared to the other figures within the scene. So we have within this painting a image of a kind of performance of racism, and blackface is undeniably a performance of racism, as well as this much more caricatured representation of a Black man. This is next to the painting of Aldridge. And when I talk about Aldridge in my tours, I'm always very clear to focus on the fact that he was a pioneer. He was a modern celebrity in his lifetime. His politics led him to be involved in the abolitionist movement in the UK, and he has a huge amount of prominence within British history. But we have to understand that in relation to the other paintings that are around him. We have this image directly next to that one that includes a very, very violent image of race. And there are other paintings within the Tate collection that date beyond that Aldridge one. This is from the 1840s of an anonymous subject and an anonymous artist. So again, we have the question about the possible display value of this painting. It's very beautiful, but we have so little information about it that the label is essentially blank. The final Tate object that I want to talk about is this one of Sir Francis Ford's children giving a coin to a beggar boy. This is something that I talk about a lot in my tours because of the way that it represents the legacies and connections of enslavement in the UK and the way that that history connects. Ford was a third-generation plantation owner. His family were wealthy because of the plantations and enslaved people that they owned in Barbados. The children represented in this portrait inherited that wealth. And this is a private commission that's designed for display, most likely in Ford's home. The children are giving a coin to a beggar, and this painting is intended to be a kind of allegory of charity. But it has this additional context, which is the fact that Ford was famous for his statements in Parliament that the poor in England were worse off than slaves in the colonies. And so we have this history of someone like Ford justifying his continued investment in enslavement and speaking out against the abolitionist movement on the basis that that money, that wealth would benefit people in England. And this painting to me is a very clear articulation of his politics. So we can't separate the two. They're very deeply enmeshed. With that kind of context, we need to simultaneously recognize the way that British slave owners and people involved in the kind of broader network of enslavement are shaping artistic taste. They're artistic patrons. The paintings that we have on display are connected to them. But beyond that, we also need to do the work of identifying the subjects included within these images. There have been a number of projects recently that are very much focused on the idea of identifying slave ownership within gallery patronage. But to me, there's also a kind of parallel work, which is very much being led by Dr. Denise Murrell, of representing the identities of the individual models that are used in these paintings. So Murrell's work became an exhibition, firstly in the States and then in France, that specifically worked to find, as far as possible, the names and identities of the people of color who served as models for artists at this time. There's something I think that we can do to expand on this work. Her project focused mainly on French art, and there's definitely space for a British parallel. With that in mind, I went to the Art UK database, which is a classic place to start with any artistic project, I think, and found images like this one of George IV, which includes the presence of a black page. The image tags for this are on the next slide. So you can see here, on the Art UK database, we have, among other things, 6,000 paintings tagged with cloud, and 2,900 tagged with wig, but we have 37 tagged with African and 12 tagged with slave. That's not representative of the actual portraits of Black people on this database. There is a lot more out there, but these images don't have the kind of necessarily the research interest in them beyond that. I went through both of these tags, and the next images I've got are some of the examples that I pulled out. But they are very much paintings where the descriptions focus entirely on the white subject here, and there will be a fleeting mention to the presence of a Black servant, attendant. Sometimes these people are referred to as slaves, although there is actually very little material evidence for what their legal status would have been, and not all of these paintings are British. They cover a very wide range of dates. And instead, we have these kind of absent presences. It's very much the case that these images are being haunted by the presence of people of color within these paintings. Which brings me to this one. This is of John Manners, the Marquis of Granby. Granby. It's in the Royal Collection, and records suggest that Joshua Reynolds used his own servant as the model for the page. I have not been able to find out the name of this servant, but we know that Reynolds's Black servant was involved in a court case at the Old Bailey. And we know that he gave evidence in this case, and it's recorded in quite a lot of detail in biographies of Reynolds. Essentially, the servant was attacked and robbed and did not tell Reynolds that it had happened because he was worried about being punished. Reynolds finds out that the servant was robbed because he reads about it in the newspapers. And we've got a fairly set date that this would have happened. We know that it's something, the trial takes place at the Old Bailey, the servant is called as a witness, and it's reported in the press. So there are several directions that we could go in to try and find out more about this individual and find out his name. At the point of the gallery label, we have no information about the man in this painting at all. He's just included as an attendant, and the descriptions of this image very much focus on his lack of presence. It's all about the Marquis of Granby. And so from that, we come on to other subjects like Henry Beckford. Beckford is one of the people I talk about in my tours, and in this case we have his name, but we have very little biographical detail. it's almost certain that Beckford was either enslaved by the Beckford family or was descended from people enslaved by the Beckford family. We know he was an emancipated slave who took part in the Anti-Slavery Society Convention of 1840, which is what this painting shows. And he's given a very prominent position within the painting, although in Hayden's descriptions of creating the scene and in his diaries, he's almost exclusively referred to as the African rather than by name. So we have someone with fragments of biography. We've got his name, we've got a little bit of information about his dates, and it's most likely actually that his children founded a school. So there's more information that could be found there. He may have been a minister as well. I've found someone called Henry Beckford showing up in church records around this time in Jamaica. But his presence in the painting is still very much used to illustrate the diversity of the abolitionist movement. He is one of 3 Black faces within this scene, and those individuals are always pulled out by the National Portrait Gallery and by other educators using this as examples of Black abolitionists. Rather than necessarily focusing on the individual biographies of these people, it's about the fact that they're present, and that's enough. Having Beckford's name, having this information about him is important and it's valuable, but we could get more. And the same goes for Reynolds' servants and the other figures that I've talked about here. It's not impossible to, with the right resources, the time and energy, do this work. So much of the focus right now is on finding the connections between British art institutions and slave ownership, and that is a very valid project, and I think it's something that absolutely needs to be done. But there has to be this kind of parallel and more expansive work to try and identify these subjects. It's something that needs to be used to balance out the very dominant white narratives that we still see around the history of the slave trade. The fact that when we talk about the abolitionist movement in schools, there's so much emphasis placed on figures like Clarkson and Wilberforce. And finding out more about these people would expand our options for curricula, as well as enhancing the information that we have in galleries. I'm very conscious of the time, and so I want to tie this up here, and hopefully we'll have time for questions afterwards. But thank you. I hope this was interesting. This is not necessarily a project that I think I am the person to do, but it's something that I would really strongly encourage other researchers to take part in, and using the Art UK database may be a decent starting point for finding more of these images, or at least expanding the tags that we have, because frankly, 6,000 paintings of clouds and 12 paintings tagged slave seems a little uneven to me, and it would be great to have more information available as the potential beginning point for these projects. Thank you.
Thank you for that. Thank you for that, Alice. And thank you for finishing a little before time, which is good. Perfect timing. Melissa's back. Fantastic, fantastic. So, Melissa, if you can, just let me hear your voice so I know you're really there.
Hello.
Fantastic, fantastic. Perhaps that you want to continue where you left off. This is great news. Excellent.
Well, I'm not sure where I dropped off. What can you remember? What slide?
It's about 2 or 3 slides in. You were the activist.
Oh.
You were showing what you're on the front. You were in Black Lives Matter. You were doing your thing.
Okay, cool. All right.
So the floor is yours. Fantastic.
Well, I had a good practice session then, I suppose. All right, I'm sharing my screen again. Let's see. It's not letting me share my co-hosting. It's not letting me share.
Philip, do you have the rights from Olga, if Olga's not in the room, to grant Melissa hosting rights?
I'm just having a quick look.
I'm going to go fix my slide.
And I see. Yeah. Okay. Here we go. Have a go.
Right. Can people see my screen?
Not yet.
Can people see my slide?
Not yet.
Not yet. Okay.
Yeah. Here we go.
Okay. Okay. Have we seen this slide?
I think that's where we ended, wasn't it?
Fantastic. So this is me earning my crust as a metal worker and a welder. And then what else I do, which earns less money, is I make art, political art, that hopefully has some element of engagement where the audience can try to take on and interact with some of the ideas that I'm presenting in my projects. Right. So today I'm talking about a project I did this summer, which is called Chilling in the Shambles. But it's a talk of two parts because I wanted to talk about why people have been losing their minds about our public art, given everything going on with the tearing down of the statues. And then what do we do with the statues now that they're torn down? And then the second part is the theoretical foundations of my project, Chilling in the Shambles, which took part in Seven Oaks, which is a small town. So public art, people are losing their minds. Why is this? So when I was developing my project, I came up with the constraints related to a public art project of the three sacreds. So for regular people who go into public spaces and they see public art object, they're kind of some inviolable concepts that they're dealing with emotionally. That's the place, the art object, and the historical record. So the first sacred is the place. We all know what a public space is. Kind of the important feature about this is it's a place where we can meet with others, fellow residents or visitors, and that people are expected to behave sort of decently. There's some unspoken rules about how to behave. In big cities in particular, you have this concept of it's a place where you can see others and you will be seen. So that acts as a reinforcement on our behavior. So the sanctity of place, it's a place where we meet as equals. Everyone's going to behave with some sort of decency towards each other. This is why these spaces are so effective for political action, because it pushes up against that idea of what decent behavior is. Small towns have public spaces too, but the dynamic is slightly different. When you're in a city, you have the sense that you're sharing this place with millions of other people. When you talk about a small town, it's most likely about the residents, and they will have a much greater emotional bond with these spaces. It's where they have lived out their lives and gotten to know their neighbors. So it starts to form a tight relationship with the stories we tell about ourselves and our lives and where we're from. The second sacred is the art object. We've all been trained from a very young age to go into museums and be very solemn and serious about the objects we've been told to look at, whether it's an old object, which obviously is meant to stand the test of time, so we have to be very respectful of these old things, or they can be objects that are dealing with complex ideas. And so we need to be very serious and respectful of someone who's exploring big thoughts. So the sanctity of art is the belief that art is our culture, and an attack on the art object, though not necessarily the art ideas, we worry about losing our culture. And that's the thin end of the wedge, and civilization is going to be destroyed and it'll be chaos. Just as an example of what happens if people feel there's a mismatch between the place and the object was the helter-skelter in the cathedral in Norwich last year. The bishop feels very strongly that cathedrals are public spaces, and he wanted people to look at the cathedral with different eyes from that point of view. People weren't happy with the conflict between the helter-skelter and the space of the cathedral because they felt it sent signals that will change people's behavior. So that's just an example of how you can get people upset about these conflicts. The third sacred is the historical record. Now, you guys are professional historians, and you know that these are kind of changeable things that need to be reviewed. We've been talking about this today. But for ordinary people, our training is we go to school and we're presented with facts, and you can't get those facts wrong, and any idea that you might change those facts is just, you're going to fail in understanding your life. So let's look at some examples of the historical record. On the left, this was the coverage of the protest I took part in. A journalist came and wrote up their version of what they thought we were up to. On the upper left-hand side, we have some unfortunate reporting from the Los Angeles Times in 1981. And we don't need to know any more about that. So I'll just take that away, but it will be relevant. It'll come up a little bit later. In the lower corner, we have a picture from a history book published in 1901 about Sevenoaks. The space being shown is the shambles, and it's being portrayed in a particular way. It's nice and clean, and it's sunshiny, and we have some happy peasants who seem very content with their life there in the shambles. So for regular people, we get an idea of our place and people's existences from these types of records, and we think they're kind of permanent and you can't mess with them. So the sanctity of historical evidence. I was thinking of a conversation I had with one of my former fellow students from Sarah Lawrence, Dr. Julie Gayadayangani. She wasn't a doctor back then, but we were catching up, and she said, we were talking about her family. She said, I can't believe you have kids. I need to see pictures. You know what they say, if there ain't pictures, it never happened. At the time, I thought that's a funny thing to say. But Julie comes from a very respected African-American family of civil rights activists. So while it was a new idea to me, it was a very real part of her worldview. So this was my first introduction to this idea of the importance of historical evidence. So in summary, of the first part, powerful art blends the place, the art object, and the historical record. You get those three resonating together, you can have something very, very effective. So here's my project. Took part this summer. There was a call out for local artists to apply for a project taking part in the medieval quarter of Sevenoaks, which is my local small town, to paint the access doors entering into the square, which were kind of unattractive. So I inquired what was the project about, what were they looking for? And they said, well, there's no money, but you can paint whatever you want, which is a dangerous thing, of course, to say to a political artist, because we kind of will paint whatever we want. But it was a public art project, so I needed to think about the place and the cultural object and the historical record. And the whatever I want part had to fit within a pretty small space. So some of the ideas that fit within that whatever I want, I wanted to talk about three artists that had a major influence on my thinking. The first one, many of you, I'm sure, are familiar with, is Neil Kenlock. He is a photographer. He's British. He was the official photographer for the Black Panther UK party. And in one of his talks, he talked about what I call radical archivism. He said about his work then, those pictures were taken so people could learn. If I had not done that, people would say it didn't happen. So for me, that was reflecting back again on what Julie had said to me. It started to form an idea in my head, this idea that artists can on purpose make work that becomes the archive, or it can riff off of the archive. So this is an idea that's getting a lot of traction with artists at the moment. The second artist who's had a big influence in my life is Michael D. McCarty. He lives in Los Angeles. Remember that unfortunate headline about marauders upsetting the suburbanites? So I guess that's my friend Michael here. He comes from that neighborhood, him and his neighbors. And then we have a nice breakfast of fried catfish and then carry on with marauding, I guess, while telling stories to each other, talking about philosophy and stuff. This is a quote from him about radical storytelling. If your vision is for 1 year, you plant rice, so you're thinking about yourself. If your vision is for 10 years, plant trees. Okay, so now our ideas are starting to extend to our environment. But if your vision is for 100 years, educate children. So that's thinking about what am I doing and how is that going to help or affect or impact the people who will come after me. So this is quite a big concept of thinking about what we're doing. The third artist who's also had a big impact on my practice is British non-binary artist Jacob V. Joyce. And at a talk a few years ago, for me, this was kind of a new idea. He was talking about the gaze. This is a common idea amongst artists. It's about a power relationship, usually starts between the artist and the subject. And that translates into the viewer looking at the picture. And it's about the power relationship. And Jacob said in this talk, what happens when the picture gazes at the viewer? What happens when the gaze becomes subverted? And can we change that power relationship? So those three ideas kind of put together into the whatever I want aspect. So let's take a look at the place that I've been allocated, this cupboard that's all black. The space is known for its medieval roots. I felt quite a burden of responsibility in thinking about that. It's known as the shambles, so people have an idea of what went on in that space. There's the two pre-existing artworks, which when I went to take a look at them, you know, they were very white, a lot of white figures. And that was one of the things that I wanted to push up against, because it was telling a story about our local history and was basically saying there's no diversity here. So I had a curiosity about that and I wanted to push against that. It's also a gathering place for local people of all ages. And this happens night and day. And there are the local businesses and their customers that I also needed to reflect on. This was the art object that I made. So it's a mural and a plaque. And so I wanted to add a non-typical figure to basically a conventional street scene. I wanted to link current events to local social history. A lot of my work is about current events. So this work fit within my broader practice. And I also wanted to interrupt the historical representations of Black people in European art. So I didn't want to just replicate how Africans had been presented in European art. I needed to go somewhere else. And now we're looking at the historical record. Now, the last thing I expected to do when I made this was to have to give an account of my picture to a room full of distinguished historic academics. But here we go, I'll give it a good go. The plaque says, our Black history could go back to 1500 with skilled workers visiting the shambles en route between Rye and London. It took me a long time to come up with those words and also to get comfortable with that statement. So I was really nailing my colors to the mast, but here I go, I'll give a good account of myself. So the short time I had to gather my research together, I had established that Africans could be found across Europe by 1500. Gifts, including human beings, that showed geopolitical power were standard practice. The cinque ports were England's link with the continent in 1500 and before. And Sevenoaks was structured economically as a thoroughfare, which was quite a major road between Rye and London in 1500. There's more history, as we again have been discussing today, that's not always well documented, but we do know that Venetian merchants financed much of European trade in 1500 and before, including the slave trade. Venetian habitation records, which was part of that trade network in England, hint at widespread tax evasion and that local families were facilitating that. And it's fairly well known that smuggling in general is key to the economy in Kent and Sussex throughout this time period. And smuggling is part of tax evasion. So here's my radical story that I crafted together with that information, which is with continental trade, legitimate and illegitimate, passing through Sevenoaks regularly, it's not impossible to imagine foreign workers, African workers among them, making their commute to or from London around the year 1500. So what has been the response to the picture? I've had spontaneous hugs from the people who knew that I made this picture. I've had shout outs, or rather the picture has had shout outs from local family-owned businesses. I've had strange arguments about the materials that I used by people who are clearly perhaps uncomfortable with the picture, uncomfortable with the work, but they wanted to keep it focused on the materials I used. There were fears expressed by my friends for my safety, but nothing's come of that. And there's been no vandalism to the picture so far. So in summary of the second part, my opinion of effective political art in sort of as a blend of radical archivism, storytelling, with an invitation to the audience to engage and participate in the ideas. That's my talk. Thanks for listening. Here are my references.
Well, thank you for that, Melissa. I'm so glad you made it in. I'm so glad you made it, because that's you raised some great points there. I personally want to interrogate you, but it's not for me. I want to get some questions from the chat. But we'll go in order. We'll start with Mark. There was a point from Miranda made about the history of the person who commissioned the painting and his family. In fact, he was involved with a mixed marriage, a mixed heritage marriage. Do you want to say some comments on that about his history? Mark, did you get my question? Hello, Mark.
That's me. I lost.
Hello.
Sorry, should I reiterate the question? So I was just interested in John Wilmot's father being the judge in the Hylas versus Newton case. And it's just a quite interesting family connection to the Black Loyalist story.
Yes, and you wrote saying that you couldn't find it in the original book, which tells me I should go, but in these lockdown times, I didn't actually get to see it. And it was 18 months ago since I was working on that, and I don't remember, but I think it was his story. I was in fact writing a paper which is coming out about the Wilmot family and other aspects of slavery as well, because his son was an MP, actually in the picture of Parliament that we were shown at that Alice showed. An Eardley Wilmot is in the corner, and he spoke out against also the compensation of the 1830s. So there is an interesting element of in the Wilmot family, apart from that particular picture.
Mark, can I ask you a question about the West's actual image? You showed a sketch or an engraving, and then you showed a kind of a study within the painting.
Yes.
Why do you think the painting was never done? Was it too big, too ambitious?
Well, that's, I think, my talk didn't actually explain to you properly then, so if you have to ask me now. And I think he certainly got on well with Wilmot. He went, I've got some material from Yale which shows he went and ate with him and invited him to the Royal Academy annual dinner. And I think he saw himself as a loyalist, as he saw Wilmot as a loyalist. I think he had also done in the previous year with Henry Moses some publications of his engravings. And I think he chose only to do a sketch and to put it in that way in the portrait as a means of showing a painting which might not have gone down very well if it had been done as a full painting. And there is no record of a full painting actually being either sold or exhibited or existing in anyone's subsequent collection.
Okay, thank you. And now a couple of questions for Alice. There's some debate in chat about that picture on the cover of your book, where you still question, is it Ignatius Sancho? But a lot of people, Patterson Joseph in particular, who did the definitive Ignatius Sancho, says that is not. Yet you still remain. I said you were equivocal. Are you equivocal? Is it, to your mind, could it be?
Yeah, okay, this is really tricky. I use it as an example because of the way that it has been identified as being of him. So, like, I think Miranda pointed out in the chat as well that there's also the absolute possibility that it could be neither of these men. And I think you described it as like a failure of imagination, that no one could conceive of the fact that there might be a third person who would be the subject of this portrait. I use it as an example because of the way that it's been attributed over time. So it shows up all the time. I didn't include the screenshots here, but it's always one of the first results when you Google Ignatius Sancho, and it shows up as well for Olera Equiano and Otoba Kugoano as well, and any other number of Black abolitionists of the period. And so whatever the attribution of it, it still circulates as a portrait of Sancho, which is what interests me here, not so much the actual way that we could pin this subject, but the fact that it has been identified as of him, and the way that that lingers, even in the face of research and writing like Patterson Joseph's, and the fact that it doesn't go away is interesting to me.
Kathy Chater makes the point about Joshua Reynolds' servant. Who was he? Did he really exist? And is that him in that particular painting? Now, I'd go a little bit further. You had the picture of Francis Barber, which you said it could be Francis Barber or it could be Reynolds' servant. Let me put you on the spot. Is it Francis Barber? Is it his servant? Or is it an unknown artist, an unknown sitter?
I think there's there's more documentation in favor of it being Barber than in being Reynolds' servant. The problem with talking about identifying portrait subjects is that this is not my specialism. I am an educator, and the work that I do as a guide is about opening up these discussions and conversations with people in the gallery. So when I talk about the portrait that might be of Barber, one of the things that we discuss with my groups is the uncertainty and the fact that we would not see a portrait necessarily of a white subject with this same kind of conversation around it. So what does the uncertainty or possible anonymity of this portrait tell us about how galleries have accumulated collections? Well, it shows us that this portrait made it into the collection because of the link to Reynolds rather than because of the biography of the subject. And so what does that show us about how these stories have been told over time? It's about the uncertainty and the ambiguity. What I'm arguing for is more resources and more attention being given to the possible anonymity or identity of these subjects. Like, more than anything, I would just love people to put more effort into this. And when I discuss this in my work, it's from the perspective of trying to understand how these identities have been lost. At some point, these portraits had names. At some point, even if it was just on a scrap of paper in a studio, someone knew who the sitter was. What has happened between then and now to make these people disappear? And what can we do to try and re-identify them?
Yeah, and I shouldn't do this as chairman, I should be independent. But having looked at that picture, because there's several images of that Francis Barber in air quotes. And there's an argument that for me, increasingly the argument for that it was a servant of Reynolds that he got his students to paint as an exercise, because there's so many of them that it does look, and the quality varies, so it does look like a student exercise, and that would fit the narrative. But to your point, why was the name lost? Why was it considered not that important not to note his name? So I accept that point. I do. Having said that, I should be neutral. So I'll go back to being neutral. Mel, I just want to pick up on the shambles there, and maybe I missed it. But did you say you got no negative response from it? It was you said you got some hugs. Was that the predominant response?
So people in Sevenoaks are very polite, and did I get no negative response? So like I said, I didn't sign the picture. My name is not on this picture. So there's a tag to an Instagram account. There's been only positive responses to the Instagram account, which has been lovely. But sitting in the shambles and watching people pass and watching their reactions to the picture, it's still not negative. I have seen people walking very determinedly through the space. The picture catches their eye. I have seen one woman put her shopping down on the ground and look full face at the picture and like really take it in, and then pick up her shopping and carry on through. And so it's quite satisfying for an artist that you produce a picture that's going to stop someone in their tracks like that. I haven't had to my face or even sort of through my network any negative comments about it.
Well, that's excellent. That's very interesting. Now, here's a question to all three of you. All three of you have addressed the Black presence in art. Do you think
May I
that...
comment on that, please?
Please do.
As a historian and resident of Sevenoaks for the last 50 years and president of its local historical society, and also, if you can call it, the curator of an exhibition in the local library at the entrance of the presence of Black people in Sevenoaks since 1600. I can't remember any reference in the local newspaper, which is not a very readable newspaper, but I do scan it quite closely each week, of the paintings. So I wonder, Melissa, have you had any, as a historian, I look for ideally a tripod of evidence, and you sat there and you watched, but how long did you sit there and watch? And is there other comeback that you've had in any way to assess this? And incidentally, you say smuggling was key to the history of Kent and Sussex. It wasn't. It's not key. It's an element. The corn trade is much more important.
So you're asking me, did I sit and sort of survey at great length people's responses?
How long were you there?
Once the picture was posted, I did go daily. There at different times of the day because different types of people go into that space. But I don't want to be a weirdo and sort of be constantly, the shambles isn't that huge.
You certainly improved it because it's a very uninviting space to do anything in, I think. At least that bit of the shambles. The more northerly end, which you probably know, which is the narrow alleyway, is a much more attractive area. You had the back of those awful developments for shops.
It's quite...
I mean, anything that you could have done there would have improved it.
Well, keep visiting it because there's other artists working in that space as well. So, And I don't know if you've seen the Goose Girl, which is a fabulous picture, beautiful picture by a very good artist who's been added as well. Have you heard anything, David? Let me put a question to you. Have you heard anything?
No, that's why I was surprised, because I'd not heard this. I keep my nose and ear fairly close to the ground, and I know the area fairly well. But no, I've not heard anything. I live not quite in the centre of the town, but I live within 3/4 of a mile of it. So I was surprised that you've crept up and done something on my backyard, and I wasn't aware.
We did do it under cover of darkness to protect my identity. Yes, it was quite entertaining.
But I think it's a great idea to draw people's attention to not what actually happened, but to think outside the box.
Thank you. Yeah, that was my objective.
The first record that we have of Black people in that particular town. I have written about them in Kent as well, but in that town is in the Knoll Records, the list of servants, and you have a John Morocco and a Mary Robinson who are described as blackamoors, and that's in a list that dates from 1613 to 1624. There's no earlier record, but there could be. There are plenty of black. You're right. Plenty of black people passed through Sevenoaks, particularly in the 18th century. Jack Beef, for example, they're going to Tunbridge Wells. The black servants come through, and then they're visitors and travellers.
Yeah. So I was inspired by that kind of concept, and obviously you can tell by my accent that I wasn't raised properly in England. So my experience of being a foreigner kind of feeds into that concept that foreigners are not really recognized as being of a place. And from a historical context, I don't think that's necessarily true. Visitors and travelers and even passers through start to shape and do have an effect on a space. So that was kind of some of my conceptual thinking.
David, it sounds like you should pitch a piece to the local paper. Maybe you can write a review with a historical commentary on the piece. Or echoing back to the first panel today, we should get some local school kids to do a project on it, come and look at it, write up their thoughts on it, research whether they think that there could have been people who looked at that walking through Sevenoaks.
My very thoughts, yes, indeed.
In those famous words, perhaps you two can take that offline and put a little bit of a project together and report back.
Yes, sir.
Is that a yes, Miranda?
Well, yeah, and I think Melissa, did I put you in touch with the Medway History Centre? There are definitely some school teachers in Kent who are interested in this sort of thing. So,
Nate,
we continue.
Okay, I've got one specific question to Alice and then a general question to the panel before we close the session. Somebody asked the question, and I should have asked you, it said, do you have any pictures with black characters center stage as well as just attendance?
Yes, but this is such an important caveat that we both experience in our work, I know, which is the difficulty of, firstly, what's made, what survives, and then what's on display, and the kind of levels of erasure that go into creating gallery spaces. There are images that include main characters. I would say that the unknown subject, unknown artist from the Tate Britain collection that I showed is of an individual, and it's very clearly a portrait of an individual. But we have no information about who that person might be. And the clothing that he's wearing doesn't give us any clues because it's sort of just generic North African, Middle Eastern exoticism costume. We've got the portraits of people like Ira Aldridge, which do tend to be created as promotional imagery or in some way are related to his performances. And we've got the fact that any of these portraits that would have been created for authors show up again and again. So the ones that would then be used to create an engraving for the frontispiece of a book. So that's why we have the portrait of Olo Aquilano coming in. There may well have been an original painting for that does not survive. One of my favorite examples is the portrait of Ayuba Suleiman Diallo, which is a very beautiful, very highly individualized and quite compassionate painting, I think. But the circumstances of its creation are that it was commissioned by the Royal Africa Company. And so when we do have these images and they do survive and they do end up on display, there's still a kind of political layer around these images of the kind of use and misuse of the individual. So there are absolutely paintings, but frequently they do still suffer from this kind of problem of layers of exclusion, shall we say. They suffer from racism. It's all about racism. That's what we're talking about here. And the fact that these paintings are not made in the first place and then don't make it into the collections because they're not considered important enough is emblematic of the systemic racism within British history and culture.
I would add that I'm aware of at least around 20 portraits where there's a black sitter as the principal sitter so far. But yeah.
How many of them are on
Can I
UK and are any of them tagged?
Well, yeah, I mean, tagging is a serious issue. I can't, certainly some of them are not. And I think the limitation of Art UK is that it only does public collections, and there's a lot more to be uncovered in private collections.
Can I defend Art UK here? They did have a tagging project, which I was part of a couple of years ago. It was a public project. Anyone could access it. But I think it just got too big and they've left it now. So they're going to stop. But I understand, last time I spoke to them, they're looking at a way to come back so that we can, the public can tag paintings. So that we can, that was 12 slaves. That's an outrageous figure, in terms of, is it as simple as that? And are they slaved? Or shouldn't they be enslaved and all that? Are they Africans? Yeah, there's a lot to be done. But I know, I understand they're up for that, but it's going to happen. When, I don't know. Here's a question to three of you in terms of, I hope you won't see it as a bit too poetic. It's about the importance of the Black presence, the allegorical presence in terms of, this is a slave, as opposed to the individual presence. Which is more important in art and in making the Black presence real? The allegorical presence or the actual individual?
So I would say that it's important to remember that these allegories had models as well. And even if it's just someone who, in the case that comes to mind for me is of the Dante Gabriel Rossetti painting The Beloved Bride, where there's the presence of a Black child in that. Rossetti decided to include a child in this painting because he'd seen Manet's Olympia and he thought it would be a visual interest to include a Black subject. He's referring to that history of tokenization and the use of a Black presence in these paintings as an allegory. He then apparently finds a model on the street, although we've got very few records about this and it's incredibly hard to pin down, which to me is an example of the fact that even when we have these allegorical presences, we can ask the question of who the model might have been and who the individual behind it might have been. We may not ever be able to pin that person down, but it's a way of remembering that even when we have the kind of caricature or allegory or trope representation, there is still humans behind that, whether it's an individual subject that was used for that painting, or if it's just the Black people that lived around the artist, who that artist saw every day and chose to use as a reference point. There is a kind of level of humanity behind these. I think in terms of understanding the allegorical presence, it's important to understand how those images have been used, and the way that those images have been manipulated is part of the biographies of these paintings as well. I don't know if that really gets into your question, but
no, certainly address the allegorical side of it. Melissa, Mark, do you want to comment?
I think I want to hark back to something Susanna said about museums and curation, and that there's a separation between valuing the object, and from my perspective, the art object as an aesthetic thing or as a storytelling device, versus valuing people. So then in my practice, the display of the object is a critical part of the project. They're never separate. Other artists don't necessarily operate that way, and they become much more object focused. So I would say those are the two things. For me, the presence of people of color in my artwork is incredibly important because it feeds into my sense of place and then the story that I want to tell around that. To the audience, I expect the picture to be shown too, or the context within it is. But different artists have, different ways of approaching. It depends on the practice.
Mark, do you want to have the final comment?
Well, only Michael, I want to thank you for allowing me as a naive tyro joining with in art history in this discussion, which has been fascinating for me and sent me away to do a lot more thinking and reading about this field.
Okay, well, thank you for that. Well, look, we finished this session on time, I think 5:30. And we're going to go to a wrap up now. Philip, do you want to take the lead?
Well, only really, I suppose, to chair and ask you and Joanna. Joanna's been watching very, very patiently and is one of the organizers of this conference. So maybe if I could ask the three of you if you'd like to sort of comment on particular things that have come up, and I'll wrap up at the end. Michael, why don't you go first? Would you like to sort of say any?
Did you invite me to go first? Sorry?
Would you like to give any concluding thoughts, Michael?
The first, this has been this has been a really, really, as I was, it's interesting. It's like nice. It doesn't do it justice. It's been a really powerful day for me in terms of the questions it asked, and the way we addressed in terms of identity. And I was particularly impressed by the morning session because my take, I had a long discussion about role playing in the teaching of Black history, of teaching empire and slavery. And I have to be upfront here. That to me is a no-no. Nobody wins, and it always ends in tears to my mind. Yet there were some people who still believed in it. They still argued for it. So I'm still not convinced that role-playing is appropriate. Yet I can see how some people might think it fits into their practice. It'd be interesting to see Yvonne's results of her research in terms of how, to my mind, I think it's damaging because it creates. Yvonne wants to come back.
No, just to say, I mean, I agree with you. There's a big question mark. There's a big question mark there because if you're going to use role play, it has to be used well, and you have to know why you're actually using it. It needs to be steeped in the sources, etc. So I do want to find out and have a little bit more look at that. I know, for example, when I work with my student teachers, history teachers, we have a similar discussion when we're talking about teaching about the Holocaust. And again, we say, do we actually need to get the children to imagine they were in a cattle truck being taken to, a death camp? We can just read that. We can actually read themselves and listen to the people who are actually there and empathize that way. So you don't necessarily have to do role play, but as a pedagogue, I wouldn't necessarily rule it out without actually exploring it further. But I think it depends on the type of role play, how it's set up, the questions that are asked. That role play that I had in that example, for example, where the children were asked to squeeze themselves in a small place on the floor. Again, it's not recreating the actual event, but you can see it might not be as distressing as some of the others. But yeah, I think there's a big question mark, and it's one that I actually want to explore because obviously from the little bit of research that's out there, children are finding it uncomfortable. So again, I want to listen to the children too.
Michael, in my brutal Catholic comprehensive school in Hull in the 1970s, the history teacher, John Oxley, famously used to take the kids out on a freezing, snowbound playing field and get them to take their blazers off and stand for 30 minutes to impress on them what it was like to be Hitler's army besieging Moscow in 1941. And I guarantee you it did make a lasting impression. Whether it was a good thing or not, I'm not quite sure.
Can I come back? I know Ty's not our friend, but I'm going to come back at that. That is just one aspect of that. It didn't talk about the guys were starving. It didn't talk about the fact that they were wounded. It just gives you one dimension.
Yeah.
I put it in the same box as when you see these monuments to slavery, which do show the broken chains. It's a complete nonsense. That's just one small aspect of it. It doesn't talk about the pain, the hurt, the separation. So these and sorry, Yvonne, when you get them to get the kids to be in a small space and confined, that's just one aspect of it. What about someone defecating in front of you, or urinating, or having a baby? You cannot.
Yeah. So obviously,
so if you're going to role play, you got to get it right. And I don't think.
No, but to do that, I mean, those are the things that would be too distressing to actually.
Well, then let's not do it. Then let's look at the economic, social, the cultural, the religious aspects of it, which you get into people's heads. Sorry, it's a bit an emotional subject for me because I just get frustrated when people think body works.
I think we might have to move on, but I know that sort of being to take Michael's point, playing the part of the Wehrmacht was a lot less uncomfortable than playing rugby in the snow, which I frequently had to do.
Can I just finish on my day? I thought the database session, the database session was just brilliant. Having spent some time in the Voyagers database, I can see how that's all these other databases come from it, and see how they interfeed with each other. And you can see graphs that lay onto each other in terms of those letters and the number of slaves that have been transported. You can overlay the graphs and get some fantastic correlations. So I got some great ideas from that. And I'll just finish off on my own section. I thought it was just great just to start to talk about art and different ways into the art, particularly Alice's polemic and Mark's revelation on that painting I'd not seen before, and the fact that Mel's painting survived and it wasn't vandalized. In fact, not quite celebrated because it didn't appear in the newspaper, but it was not vandalized. So no, I thought it was a really excellent day as far as I'm concerned.
Thank you. Miranda, you'd like to come in?
Oh, sorry. Well, Joanna, why don't you go first? Because I've said way more than you today.
That's okay. I've been listening. I think it's been such an amazing day, actually. And thank you to all the speakers. So for me, I think the sort of highlights in terms of what I'm thinking about taking forward with the education and engagement panel. I think really this idea again of sort of family histories and local histories, these kind of micro histories as a way into a broader understanding of Black history, I think really is so powerful. And I've seen other sort of case studies where again, I just think there's something that can really ignite, I guess, a class's curiosity if we're looking at histories that really kind of dig down into things that they can link to their lives as they live them or their own communities. I'm being a bit vague. I'm not really articulating my thoughts very well, but that's what I was thinking. I'd like to go back to the Newham team and speak about in more depth with them about that. With the databases, I'm really thinking again, there's so much sort of potential for crossover there, I think, with that kind of information coming out now and our teachers and education teams and those kind of networks that are sort of growing up. So I'd be interested to see moving forward whether the researchers building those databases and bringing that information together. I think, Katie has said she's looking at developing some teaching resources potentially off the back of that. And in terms of our last session, I'm really thinking again, I mean, Alice, the work that you were talking about, I'm really curious. I know, Miranda, you're doing work to take this forward, but I'd really love to hear from curators in galleries about what work they're doing about these gaps and omissions, because what I just genuinely kind of feel still quite flummoxed by is what seems to be a real lack of will, actually, and sort of time put into doing that work, and what seems to be a kind of complacency actually around sort of labeling around sort of background research into who these people are in these portraits. And I think that's a real matter of concern, to be honest. I can't quite believe that we're still at a stage whereby there doesn't really seem to be a drive on the part of curators to do that work. But Miranda, you can probably kind of speak to that more. I know you've put a lot of energy into kind of moving that forward.
Okay. Right. Yeah. A few things. Yeah. I am currently trying to make more conversations happen in that art space, and watch this space. But hopefully, we'll have a database of portraits of Africans in British art one of these days. Progress is being made, and I am having conversations, bringing lots of people together to have these conversations. Anyway, more anon. And on what Michael and Yvonne were just talking about, I think what's really, really important is to get proper training for teachers in how to teach enslavement, and because as we've heard today, it can go so very badly wrong. And the good news is that the Historical Association actually did a summer school on this, I think last summer, and hopefully it's something they can continue with historians who'd worked on the legacies of British slave ownership database, like Katie Donington. A really well-resourced, well thought through summer school, but obviously that only reached a small number of teachers, and as usual we need funding to scale that up, because my heart sinks at the idea of teachers teaching enslavement without that kind of support and training. But anyway, hopefully we can pressure that to happen as well. There's a campaign called Teach Race Migration Empire, and one of the big pushes with that, this is the Runnymede Trust, is to get funding for a centre for teaching race, migration and empire, along the lines of the existing Centre for Holocaust Education. But I looked into the Holocaust one, and it is a joint venture between the government and the Pears Foundation, which is a family charity, originally a Jewish family. So if we're going to get the government to do anything, we probably need someone else to throw some money in. But anyway, that's a whole other story. I have a blog I'm trying to get around to publishing about the whole subject of teaching Black British history. But and I think just so back on sort of my thoughts on the day, I think echoing Joanna, I think there's a lot of cross-pollination that can happen. And actually we did have trouble putting the papers into panels, because so many of them speak to each other. Particularly, we heard about museums from Susanna in the morning, and then Alice's paper was also very, spoke to similar themes. So, I'd like to see artists and school children being inspired by stories in the databases. I'd like, the databases to all link up with each other. I'd like, what am I trying to say? And I think there's just so much more to explore, and it's all about, hopefully days like today, the idea is to make these connections, to get people thinking about what they're doing can speak to what other people are doing, and make those connections and start those conversations. I think another important thing that kind of came up more in the chat than it was even more things happening in the chat now. But we spoke earlier in the morning on the chat about the issue of whether white historians should be writing Black history. Can anyone write anything? Are there, what are the issues around that? And it's also come up in the chat in the last few minutes about the composition of the panels today. The observation was made that the afternoon's panels had more white presenters, and the morning was a bit more mixed. And I think this is something we've always been conscious of when planning these events, and we do our best, but I think we can always try to do better, and we'd like to continue having those conversations about how we can do more there. I'd say that we've usually operated of putting out a call for papers and getting proposals in, and then trying to match the topics of the proposals together into panels. And so to that extent, we've been limited by who sent proposals in. Today's event is sort of part 2 of an event. Of the first event was in October, and so both events were drawn from the same pile of proposals, and that is part of the story. I mean, I think if you look back over all our events, you'll find there is quite a lot of diversity, but we're always looking for more. And part of our purpose is to give a platform to voices that haven't traditionally had this sort of platform. So really, it's about spreading the word and having the conversations. But I think there's a lot of value in having a wide range of people researching Black British history and having those conversations, because it is British history as well, and it's important for all British people to know this history. So I don't have anything else to say. I'm happy to hang around and generally chat casually if anyone wants to hang about on the call. But really, pleased to see everyone here today.
A few final words from me. I think it's been a fantastic day. The sort of local organisers of the Olympics are always supposed to say this has been the best Olympic Games ever. Is that true? I think this has been. I mean, it's been as good, if not better, as any what's happening in Black British History workshop we've organised, and they keep getting better because we keep getting more proposals. And this is a great thing about this time round. We were able to organise 2 days, and that's the other great thing about operating online. You don't have to book rooms. You've got more flexibility for putting things on and for connecting people across the world, which has been wonderful. Again, in the last two workshops we've run, we've had speakers elsewhere in Europe and in the United States, and that's been wonderful. And I think the panels have worked tremendously well. It's the first one. I mean, historians of my generation, who don't even have kids at school anymore, we're always pontificating about what children are learning in history at school without really knowing the first thing about it. And it's really wonderful actually to draw in teachers who are designing teaching courses, working with the curriculum, find out what's going on. I thought that module on African kingdoms, so interesting, that's now being taught at school.
Could I quickly add something, Philip? While you're on that topic, I suppose just really generally to sort of everybody in the room, and thinking perhaps, I don't know what you think, Miranda, Philip, Michael, about sort of for future conferences. I think certainly if there are teachers out there who are teaching these histories, as well as hearing teachers' feedback about how that work is going, I think it'd be really useful to hear from some students as well in your classroom, how they've experienced that work and their own reflections on that work. So just something to put out to the group whilst people are here in the room, in case there are people sort of already working with this material or thinking of working with some of this material in the future, that student voices, I think, are voices that we'd really like to potentially bring into the space.
That's absolutely right. And as wide a range of people working in, teaching, disseminating Black British history as possible, and the digital humanity, what we end up calling databases and digital humanities, we struggled a bit to put those papers together, but they really worked well, and it was fascinating to see the kind of dialogue between the people involved, and that fascinating mixture of the very particular, how do you decide whether someone was of African heritage, what specifically is in the records, moving from the very particular to the very, very broad. And that was wonderful. And also, you know, I think the other thing that this series has tried to explore by going out and having workshops around the regions of the UK has been, you know, the vibrancy of local history and local means of dissemination. And that, you know, we had a sort of a mini debate among, you know, the Seven Oaks local history and Melissa's wonderful project. And Tony, you know, Tony's great presentation on Sussex, you know, Sussex and things going on in Brighton. I mean, it's so rich, and it's great to sort of bring people together. And we are going to be working in partnership with another sort of another HE institution to try and do some work, get some funding to work on our database of specialists. So that's a work in progress. But again, you know, the richness of local history. It's great to kind of you know, listen to people whose work you've been aware of. And I mean, Alice Proctor's been one of those people. Followed with great interest on Twitter. So it was wonderful to hear Alice talking about her work. And Katie Roscoe's paper, I actually realized while Katie Roscoe was speaking that I'd visited Cockatoo Island when I was in Sydney. And that strange kind of disused industrial landscape was being used as a setting for a series of art installations. Very, very spooky, really, but fascinating. I just hadn't made the connection. So it's been a wonderful day. There will be a next one. I want us to get together and put out the call for papers for that. I think probably the next one will have to be virtual as well. If we're sort of, I know we've got Bangor lined up at some point, but that would probably have to be after Easter, and it would be a shame to wait so long for the next one. So I hope we can have another one next term online. And just to thank all our speakers, all of you for taking part, and the conveners of this wonderful series, Michael, Miranda and Joanna, our events manager, Olga. And yeah, we will be making most of this available online as a recording in the near future. Have I missed anything? Would anyone like to sort of add anything before we sign off? Michael.
Phil, I'm just burning,
Yeah.
you know, the power of what we do, the power of history, the power of knowing who you are.
Yeah.
That Somali girl who was a scientist, and I can imagine her parents loved the idea of being a scientist and a doctor and all those things that go with it. But once she'd heard his story of Africa from Toby Green, African Kingdoms, she went to do history. She saw herself, or she saw Africa, and she changed the way she looked, the way she thought. Oh, that was fantastic. That shows you the power of actually knowing who you are and how you fit into the world, rather than being what the world wants you to be. You can be who you want to be. So that's for me what this is all about. So the kids can see themselves.
Yeah.
And
and
go wherever they want.
The best thing we can do to encourage a new generation of a more diverse generation of historians is to like tell these stories loudly and bring more people to the party. And I've definitely seen that happening. Partly, with my work, people who've never heard of the Black Tudors suddenly hear about them. It's a story that isn't about enslavement and doesn't involve hiding under your desk to imagine whatever. And I've had people tweeting me saying, I talked about Black Tudors at my Cambridge interview and now I've got a place, or, just Yeah, but you know, that writ large, I think, you know, and David Olusoga's work has brought it to such a huge, much bigger audience. And so yeah, I think that we can be optimistic, hopefully, for the future. So
Yeah, we can.
Onwards and upwards. All right. Well, thank you all very much, and see you soon, hopefully.